He threw his parents out to please his wife. But when she vanished, taking every penny he had, he came back to find the truth his father left behind, a truth that would change everything. Before we dive into the full story, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories. Marco Harrison had always been a son who loved too much and thought too little. At 28, he lived in a modest apartment in a quiet suburb of Chicago, a place that smelled faintly of laundry detergent, leftover coffee, and the occasional whiff of rain from the cracked window beside the kitchen sink. His life was simple, almost painfully ordinary, except for the way he loved his family. His mother, Eleanor, had raised him with patience and quiet strength, while his father, Richard, had worked long hours at a local warehouse to make ends meet. Together, they had built a home that was sturdy, filled with warmth, and layered with small sacrifices no one outside the family would ever notice. Marco's younger brother, Tyler, was 24, smart, slightly sarcastic, but loyal in ways Marco sometimes failed to appreciate. Then there was his younger sister, Clara, only 19, who carried herself with a quiet dignity and a sharp mind. She often reminded Marco of what responsibility looked like, though he rarely admitted it. On a muggy summer evening, Marco sat in his small living room, staring at his phone with an unease he could not name. He had just met someone. Her name was Vanessa. She had a smile that seemed to erase all the worries he didn't even know he had, and Marco, in his usual impulsive way, was smitten. The way she laughed at his jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about herself, he couldn't resist. He remembered the day he first brought her home to meet his parents. Eleanor had smiled politely, her hands wringing her apron nervously, while Richard had raised a brow, skeptical but welcoming. "She seems nice," Eleanor said softly, brushing a strand of gray hair behind her ear. Richard, ever the practical one, had said, "We'll see how she treats you, Marco. That's the real test." But Marco had laughed it off, his heart too clouded with excitement to listen. He wanted to believe, as he always did, that love could conquer everything. For months, life seemed to flow in a gentle rhythm. Marco spent hours trying to impress Vanessa, buying her little gifts, taking her out, bending over backward to make her happy. And slowly, the home that had once been his refuge began to shift. Marco's mother noticed it first, subtle signs of change. The way Marco no longer stayed for family dinners, how he flinched at his father's advice, how he started ignoring Tyler and Clara's calls. "Marco," Eleanor whispered one evening, touching his arm gently as he prepared to leave for another date. "Don't forget who you are, don't forget us." "I won't, Mom," Marco had said, but the words were empty, even to him. It wasn't long before the real challenge began. Vanessa, charming and persuasive, began influencing Marco's decisions. She suggested that he should have his own space, meaning he should move out, distancing himself from his parents and siblings. And Marco, desperate to please her, listened. The day came when Marco, under Vanessa's urging, asked his family to leave the house. "Mom, Dad, I think it's time we all lived separately. I need space for Vanessa and me." His voice was shaky, unsure even as he spoke. Eleanor's heart sank. She looked at the son she had raised with love and worry, seeing the conflict in his eyes, the weakness that made him vulnerable to the wrong person's influence. "Marco," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "we raised you, loved you, gave you everything. Please don't throw that away." Tyler slammed his fists lightly against the doorframe. "You can't be serious, Marco. This is insane." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "Please, Marco, think about us. Think about what's right." But Marco's desire to please Vanessa had drowned out every plea. The family packed what they could and left, seeking shelter at a small community center a few blocks away. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old blankets, and Alina felt her spirit bend under the weight of shame and worry. But she did not complain, not in front of Marco. Marco moved in with Vanessa shortly afterward. At first, life seemed bright, a swirl of laughter, expensive dinners, and new furniture. But slowly, cracks began to show. Vanessa was no longer sweet. She was demanding, critical, and manipulative. She spent money recklessly, convinced Marco to take loans and empty his savings. Marco, blinded by love or fear of losing her, obeyed without question. One cold night, as Marco counted the bills spread across the kitchen counter, a hollow feeling settled in his chest. "Vanessa, we're running out of money," he said nervously. She looked at him with disdain. "Well, maybe if you worked harder, Marco, we wouldn't have this problem. You need to be more ambitious." "But Mom and Dad, they saved everything for emergencies for us," Marco murmured, almost to himself, realizing for the first time that he had abandoned his family for someone who didn't care. Vanessa's laugh cut through the room like ice. "Your family, they're your past, I'm your future." And then, one evening, Vanessa disappeared. She left nothing but an empty apartment, a stack of unpaid bills, and a letter that mocked Marco's devotion. He sank into the floor, the cold linoleum biting into his skin, understanding at last the depth of his mistake. The community center doors opened gently, and Alina stepped in, holding a bag of food and supplies. Her eyes met Marco's, and she said nothing at first, only crouched down beside him. Tyler and Clara were behind her, holding blankets. "We never left you," Alina said softly. "We are here, Marco, always." For hours, Marco sat there, letting his tears fall freely, listening to the steady, reassuring presence of his family. For the first time, he realized that love was not something you bought or won. It was something that endured, something that gave without asking for permission. Days passed, and Marco slowly regained his strength and clarity. He remembered the sacrifices his parents had made, the years of hard work, the small investments, the careful planning that had built a future for their family. He realized that all the wealth Vanessa had chased after, money, fancy things, temporary excitement, was meaningless compared to the foundation his parents had laid for him. Alina, gentle but firm, guided Marco back toward responsibility. "You will need patience, Marco, and humility. And yes, forgiveness." Tyler gave a small smirk, not unkindly. "Welcome back, big brother, took you long enough." Clara hugged him tightly. "We missed you. Don't ever let someone take you away from us again." And as the sun rose over the city, bathing the community center in a soft, golden glow, Marco made a silent promise to himself. He would rebuild his life, not for someone else's approval, but for the family who had never left him, even when he had left them. And he would never forget the lessons of betrayal, weakness, and the enduring power of love. The story was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Marco felt hope. He would confront his mistakes, reclaim what was rightfully his, and, perhaps most importantly, learn the true meaning of family. Morning light crept across the thin curtains of the small room where Marco slept on a worn-out cot. The community shelter was quiet now, only the faint hum of traffic outside and the distant murmur of early risers filled the air. Marco sat up slowly, rubbing his face. His eyes were heavy, his chest tight with regret, but for the first time in months, he felt a strange peace. He looked to the corner where his mother, Alina, sat on a folding chair, knitting quietly. Her face looked older, lines deeper, hair grayer, but her expression was soft, forgiving. Marco's throat tightened. "Mom," he said quietly, how did you still believe in me after everything I did?" Eleanor paused, the knitting needles clicking gently. "Because," she said, "a mother doesn't stop believing in her child just because he loses his way. You fell, Marco, but you can stand again." Her voice was calm, yet every word struck like a truth Marco couldn't escape. Later that day, Marco helped around the shelter, cleaning tables, carrying boxes of food, talking to other families who, like his, had lost homes or hope. Each conversation humbled him. He realized that his story wasn't unique. There were so many others broken by trust, by love, by their own mistakes. Tyler joined him, his sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but kind. "So," he said while stacking crates of canned goods, "what's your plan now, big brother? You gonna keep sulking or actually fix things?" Marco managed a small smile. "I don't even know where to start." "Start by forgiving yourself," Tyler said simply. "Then you fix what you can." Clara, passing by with a tray of bread rolls, chimed in, "And maybe stop trusting people who only love your wallet." Her teasing earned a faint laugh from Marco, and for a brief moment, the heaviness in the room lifted. A few days later, Marco visited the old family house. It was quiet now, empty except for dust and memories. The paint on the front door had chipped, and the once vibrant garden was now overgrown with weeds. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his feet. Every corner of the house spoke to him, his childhood laughter, his father's steady footsteps, his mother's singing while cooking dinner. On the mantel above the fireplace, a framed photo still stood, the whole family together at Tyler's graduation. Marco reached out and touched the glass, whispering, "Dad, I'm sorry." He turned, his mother appeared behind him. "Your father left something for you," she said softly. "I wasn't ready to show it before, but I think it's time." She handed him a small, weathered envelope with his father's handwriting on it. The sight of that familiar scrawl made Marco's eyes sting. He sat down on the couch, unfolded the letter, and began to read. "Dear son, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to tell you these words myself. Life will test you, Marco. It will take from you everything you think you need so that you can learn what truly matters. I worked every day of my life not just to earn money, but to build a foundation for this family. The house, the savings, the land, they are all yours and your siblings, equally. But none of it will mean anything if your heart isn't right. Protect your mother. Stand by your brother and sister. And remember, wealth without love is just an empty shell. Your father, Richard." Marco's hands trembled as he held the letter. The words were simple, but they felt like an earthquake inside him. "He knew," Marco whispered. "He knew I'd lose myself." Eleanor sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Your father believed in you, even when he wasn't sure he'd live to see it." That evening, Marco went to the small office where his father had kept all his papers and notebooks. Dust lay thick across the desk, but the drawers were still neatly arranged. Inside, he found bank documents, land deeds, and something unexpected: a small black notebook labeled Family Trust. He flipped through it, eyes widening as he read. Richard had been saving for years, carefully investing, paying off small plots of land, and building quiet security for his family's future. There was far more than Marco had ever realized. "What is all this?" Marco said, calling his mother to the room. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Your father always said he wasn't rich in life, but he wanted to leave his children rich in safety. He just didn't tell you everything." Marco sat there in stunned silence. His father had been quietly preparing for a future Marco had nearly destroyed. And then a knock came at the door. It was Officer Daniels, a local policeman who had once been a friend of Richard. He looked serious, holding a folder. "Marco," he said, "we've been investigating some accounts. Seems like Vanessa's been involved in a few fraud cases. She's taken money from several people, including you." Marco froze. "What?" Daniels nodded. "We recovered some of the funds. It's not everything, but you'll get part of it back. She's disappeared out of state, but she won't get far." Elinor exhaled slowly. "Justice will find her in its own time, but for now, we have what we need: each other." Marco looked around the house, the family that stood beside him, and realized that the real wealth was what Vanessa had stolen. It was what he still had. That night, he sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. The sound of rain began to patter against the glass, soft and rhythmic. Tyler played guitar in the living room, Clara hummed along, and Elinor brewed tea in the kitchen. For the first time in years, it felt like home again. Marco spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I lost everything I thought mattered, and somehow found everything I'd forgotten." Elinor entered the room, placing a cup of tea beside him. "Sometimes God breaks you," she said gently, "so he can rebuild you the way you were meant to be." Marco nodded, letting her words sink in. He looked down at the letter once more, at his father's handwriting glowing faintly in the lamplight. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. The house was no longer silent. It was alive with forgiveness, with the sound of family, with the faint hum of new beginnings. But life was not done testing Marco yet. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread that Vanessa had resurfaced in another city under a new name. Marco's anger threatened to return, but his mother stopped him. "Don't chase the past," she warned. "Chase your redemption." And so he did. He began working at a local construction company, starting from the bottom, lifting bricks and sweeping floors. It was hard, humbling work, but every day he returned home exhausted and proud. Tyler joined him on weekends, helping when he could. Clara managed their household finances carefully, ensuring their father's savings were used wisely. Slowly, piece by piece, the Harrison family began to rebuild not just a home, but a life. At night, Marco would often sit in the same chair where his father once read the newspaper, staring out at the quiet street. The grief still hurt, the loss still ached, but beneath it all was gratitude. Gratitude for second chances, for family, and for the strength that love restores. 3 months passed. Autumn had come to Chicago. The air turned crisp. The trees along the old Harrison Street began shedding golden leaves, and the smell of rain mixed with fallen oak filled the evenings. Marco's days had become simple but steady. He worked 10-hour shifts at the construction site, returned home covered in dust, showered, ate dinner with his family, and slept peacefully. The nightmares that once haunted him, the betrayal, the empty apartment, the echo of Vanessa's laugh, had started to fade. But some nights, when the wind howled against the window, he still woke up sweating, hearing her voice in his dreams. "Your family, they're your past, I'm your future." He'd wake up, stare at the ceiling, whisper to himself, "Never again." One Saturday morning, Elinor stood by the kitchen counter, pouring tea. The aroma of cinnamon and clove filled the room. Marco came in quietly, stretching his sore arms. "Morning, Mom," he said, yawning. She smiled, eyes soft. "Morning, sweetheart. You've been working too hard. You should rest today." "I can't," Marco replied. "Mr. Heller offered me extra hours this weekend. I want to save enough to pay off Dad's last loan." Elinor looked at him proudly. "Your father would be proud of that." Before Marco could respond, the doorbell rang. It was rare for anyone to visit this early. Tyler, who was eating toast, frowned. You expecting someone?" "No," Eleanor said. "Maybe the mailman." Marco walked to the door and opened it and froze. Standing on the porch, shivering slightly in the cold wind, was Vanessa. She looked different. Her makeup was smudged, her one straight hair messy, her clothes wrinkled. She held a small purse and an expression that was half shame, half desperation. "Marco," she said, her voice trembling, I need to talk to you." Tyler stood up instantly. "You've got to be kidding me." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, silent but firm. Marco's heart thudded against his ribs. Memories flooded back, the pain, the humiliation, the night she disappeared. He swallowed hard. "What do you want, Vanessa?" She stepped closer, her voice cracking. "Please, just 5 minutes. I have nowhere to go." Eleanor placed her hand gently on Marco's arm. "Let her speak," she said softly. "Sometimes listening costs less than anger." Marco hesitated, then nodded once. "Fine, 5 minutes." They sat in the living room. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Vanessa looked around awkwardly, her eyes catching the family photos on the shelf, smiling faces she once tore apart. She began quietly. "I made mistakes, Marco, big ones. I thought I could live without you, without anyone. I got involved with people who promised easy money. It went bad." Marco crossed his arms, silent. She continued, her voice breaking. "They took everything. I have nothing left, no one. I came back because..." She looked down, tears forming. "Because I had nowhere else to go." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Marco finally spoke. His voice was calm but cold. "You didn't just leave, Vanessa. You destroyed everything. You made me choose between you and my family." "I know," she whispered. "And I was wrong. I see that now." Tyler scoffed. "Convenient time to realize that, huh? Right when you're broke." Eleanor shot him a warning glance. "Tyler," Marco didn't stop his brother. "He's right," he said quietly. "You didn't come back for me. You came back because you need something again." Vanessa's tears spilled freely now. "No, Marco, I came back because I'm sick. I have nowhere to stay. I didn't know who else to turn to." Marco stared at her, unsure whether to believe her or not. The anger inside him twisted with pity. After a long silence, he said, "You can stay at the women's shelter near the river. I'll help you get there. But you can't stay here." Vanessa's lip trembled. "Please, Marco, just a few days." Eleanor spoke then, her voice firm but compassionate. "Child, forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. You've broken trust that took years to build. My son will help you find safety, but not at the cost of reopening old wounds." Vanessa bowed her head. "I understand." She stood, clutching her purse, looking small and fragile. "Marco, I know I don't deserve this, but thank you for at least listening." Marco escorted her out silently. The cold air bit at their skin. As they walked toward the nearby bus stop, Vanessa turned to him once more. "You've changed," she said softly. "Your eyes used to look for approval. Now they just see." Marco didn't answer. He watched as she boarded the bus and disappeared into the fog. When he returned home, Tyler was packing. "Man, I can't believe you let her inside after everything." Marco sank into a chair. "I had to, not for her, for me. I needed to see her one last time, to know I've really moved on." Clara, standing in the doorway, smiled gently. "Then you did the right thing." Eleanor nodded in quiet agreement. "Forgiveness isn't weakness, Marco. It's freedom." The tension slowly eased, replaced by a calm stillness that felt like closure. 2 weeks later, life had resumed its steady rhythm. But one evening, as Marco walked home from work, he saw something unusual. A small crowd gathered outside the church near the shelter. He stepped closer and heard whispers. "Poor woman," someone said, "collapsed this morning. They said her name was Vanessa." Marco froze. He pushed through the crowd and saw the stretcher being lifted into an ambulance. Her face was pale, peaceful. A nurse nearby noticed his expression. "You knew her?" she asked gently. Marco nodded faintly. "Once," the nurse sighed. "She had late-stage cancer. No ID, no family contacts, just a note with your name." She handed him a folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he opened it. "Marco, I know I don't deserve peace, but I found it knowing you forgave me. I ruined everything beautiful you had, but maybe by leaving, I can give some of it back. There's a locker at Union Storage, number 47. The key is inside this note. I kept your father's watch, the one you thought I sold. It's yours again." Vanessa, Marco's breath caught. He closed his eyes, the ache in his chest both painful and soft. "Rest now," he whispered. "It's over." That night, he sat on the porch under a sky full of faint stars. The air was cool and still. Elinor joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "She's gone," Marco said quietly, "and somehow I feel lighter." Elinor nodded slowly. "Because forgiveness removes the weight from your heart, not from theirs." He turned to her, his voice thick. "I wish Dad could see this, all of it, everything I've learned." Elinor smiled gently. "He does. In every change you've made, in every breath of kindness you take, he's there." Marco looked at the stars. "I'll live the rest of my life trying to be the man he wanted me to be." Elinor reached over, squeezed his hand. "You already are." As the months passed, Marco's world transformed quietly. He bought back their father's old truck, repaired the house, and even helped fund the shelter that had once housed them. Tyler got promoted at work, Clara began studying to be a nurse, and Elinor finally allowed herself to rest, her eyes still kind, her heart finally at peace. Sometimes, Marco would take out his father's old watch, the one Vanessa returned, and hold it against his chest. The ticking was steady, like a heartbeat, a reminder that time, though it wounds, also heals. And every evening, when the sun dipped below the rooftops, he would whisper a silent prayer for his father, for Vanessa, and for the family that had saved him when he didn't deserve saving. Morning came thin and quiet over the neighborhood, a pale wash of light through the blinds. Marco woke before the alarm, the room smelling faintly of coffee and dust, the hum of the city beyond his window already awake. He sat on the edge of the bed and let his hands rest on his knees. The letter from his father had been read so many times the paper had softened along the creases. He still couldn't imagine how calm the handwriting had sounded then, how steady the words had seemed, as if his father had expected every wrong turn and planned around it. He washed slowly, feeling the water bucket against his skin, the ordinary sensation steadying him. Out in the kitchen, Elinor was already at the stove. She moved with the quiet economy of someone who had lived through scarcity and refused to waste any motion. Steam lifted from the pot, carrying the warm smell of onions and thyme. Marco paused in the doorway, watching her for a long breath. He still had the bruise of shame under his ribs, but it was changing into something else, responsibility, small and practical. "Morning," he said, voice soft. Elinor didn't look up at first. She kept stirring, then turned and gave him that look he knew better than any other, equal parts concern and an unbent trust. "Morning, son. Coffee?" she asked. He said. He sat. He watched the way her face softened when she poured. He thought about his father's notebook, the ledger tucked in the top drawer of the old desk, the papers that had proven his father had planned carefully, savings, a small plot of land under a different name, a sealed account with instructions. Richard had been practical in ways Marco had never learned to be. "Have you thought more about it?" Elinor asked, setting the cup in front of him. Marco cradled the warmth. He had thought about nothing else for weeks. "Every day," he said. "I saw the papers last night again. Dad left things. He left more than I realized." Elinor nodded, but there was steel behind her gentleness. "Then we make a plan," she said. "There's the house, yes, but your father put away a small parcel outside town. He wanted it kept safe. He wanted someone with steady hands to look after it." The word steady felt foreign in Marco's mouth. He had always prided himself on being easygoing, adaptable. He had not known how to be steady. He thought of Vanessa, how easily he'd traded steadiness for the glitter of now. The image of her walking away with their savings still flashed in his mind like a reprimand. "Show me," he said simply. They drove out in Richard's old truck, the one that had been cleaned and tuned under Richard's own exacting care before he passed. The engine coughed and then settled into a comforting rhythm. The road curved through fields, through the slow, open part of the world where distance made people honest. Marco watched the land slide by short hedgerows, low ridges, a farmhouse every so often. His chest throbbed with a strange anticipation, like stepping into a room he had once known and been barred from. They reached a small gate with a faded post that read the owner's name in chalk. Elinor climbed out first, her knees steady. Marco followed. The parcel was smaller than he'd imagined, a tidy sweep of land with a thin stand of trees protecting a clear patch of earth. The wire fence was intact. A small shed stood at the back, paint peeling, porch sagging. There was a smell of earth and old hay, bright and honest. Elinor handed him a thin envelope. "This was his list," she said. "Things he left in trust. He wanted you to have it when you were ready." Marco's fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were ledgers, small receipts, and, tucked last, a folded note in his father's hand. "Marco, if you are ready to carry more than regret, take the keys. Don't do it for money. Do it for work, for learning, for the kind of life that does not end with a single bright mistake. Fix the fence first, then the roof. Plant one tree. If you do this, you will find the rest." The letter felt heavier than any pile of papers. The instructions were small, almost humble: work, repair, plant. A legacy that asked not for quick gains but for steady tending. The first tasks were blunt and physical. They fixed the gate. They cleared the tall grass that had grown up in the fence lines. Marco climbed the ladder and replaced a board on the shed, his hands blackened with grime but steady. Tyler showed up that afternoon, arms folded in judgment that soon turned to practical help. Clara arrived with sandwiches and an optimistic list of suppliers. Together, they worked in the afternoon sun, the sweat on their skin a kind of baptism. "You know," Tyler said while they tightened a post, "I always thought Dad hid more than money. He hid us. He sheltered us in the way he planned." Marco's laugh was short. "I thought I had the right to trash that shelter." "Still got time to rebuild it," Clara said, smiling. "We'll do it together." Her voice carried that unspoken faith that had kept the family standing before. Marco felt something lift inside. It was not the clean resurrection he might have wanted, not a miracle, but a slow, honest reweaving of ties. Days turned into weeks. Marco learned the taste of steady labor, the ache in muscles that told you had earned the day. He sat under the trees at dusk and read the old notebooks Richard had kept, notes about maintenance, about small investments, names of neighbors who could loan a hand. He learned how to read a soil test, how to bind a wound in a fence so rain would not finish it. He learned to call contractors and bargain fairly. He learned to take his money seriously. One evening, as the sun was sliding down the western sky, Eleanor set out a small supper on the table under the back porch. The family gathered 3 simple plates, the old truck parked like a sentinel. Marco looked at them, Tyler chewing slowly, Clara with flour on her hands, and felt a bloom of gratitude that was almost terrifying. "Your father would smile to see you," Eleanor said, handing him a cup of tea. Marco's throat tightened. "I wish he had told me everything, told me how to be this man." Eleanor's expression was soft. "He taught with his life," she said. "We just had to learn by watching when he was gone." There was a knock at the gate in the night. Marco answered, wiping his hands on his pants. A man in a plain suit stood there, his badge tucked inside a wallet. Officer Daniels, the one who had brought the news about Vanessa months ago, stepped forward, his voice low and cautious. "We found a ledger in a storage locker," he said. "Seems like some accounts were cleaned up after Richard's paperwork came to light. You may have some claims to follow up. There's the matter of a small trust. Looks like Dad had it organized better than anyone realized." Marco's breath hitched in his chest. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing drastic," Daniels said. "Paperwork, phone calls, you've got family to help. Do you want me to connect you with the agent?" Marco looked at his family. The table under the porch was small and ordinary. He thought of the months he had spent chasing empty promises, of the nights when he had felt his life reduced to a single poor decision. He thought of the steady work, the way each day's labor built something that would last. He said finally, "I'll do it with them." The months that followed, the trust was settled cleanly. The parcels of land and the small accounts their father had set aside were distributed exactly as Richard had written. There was money to pay off lingering debts, enough to repair the roof properly, enough to hire help for the more dangerous work. Most important, there was the clear acceptance that the property, this land, was not a prize to be squandered. It was a responsibility. On a warm spring morning, after the roof had a new line and the fence stood proud, Marco planted the first tree. He dug with slow, steady motions, and when the sapling was set, he pressed soil around its roots with fingers that no longer flinched at grit under the nails. Tyler and Clara stood beside him. Eleanor watched from the porch, eyes bright. "Why plant one tree?" Tyler asked. Marco placed the final handful of dirt and pressed it gently. He looked at the small trunk, at the thin leaves catching the light. "Because Dad asked for it," he said. "Because it's about care, because a tree takes time. It's not for me or for money. It's for someone who will stand here after I'm gone and know that someone kept promises." Eleanor stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "He would be proud," she said. "Not because of what you fixed, but because of who you became." Marco felt the old familiar ache of grief, but this time it carried a tenderness that steadied him. The legacy his father left had never been only papers or bank accounts. It had been the instruction to be steady, patient, and kind. It was a quiet inheritance, a map of how to live that didn't glitter but would, if followed, never burn out. As the sun lowered, the family sat on the porch and watched the land breathe in the evening air. The truck, the patched fences, the newly planted tree, all of it hummed with the small, ongoing miracle of work well done. Marco touched his father's watch in his pocket, its weight a steady reminder that time would pass, that wounds would fade, and that what mattered most would be the hands you honored with your deeds. And in the quiet between each breath, Marco made a promise, not to chase bright things that fade, but to tend the slow, patient life his father had built, and to pass that steadiness down to whatever came after. The final legacy, he realized, was not the land alone. It was the courage to return, to repair, and to remain.